Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us on the second installment of our ESG conversation. Today, we'll be delving a little deeper into the issues around the just transition. Our expert panel will go into what that is, what are its implications for South Africa, and how can we make sure that we maximize that opportunity. I think the conversation that we had last week focused more on the aspects of climate financing, and today we will touch a little bit on that, but we will, more than anything else, look at the social aspects of this from a South African lens. I'm joined by an esteemed panel of experts from diverse groupings and backgrounds, and I'll give them an opportunity to introduce themselves. But by way of starting, once again, want to acknowledge our partners in this initiative, who are the Development Bank of Southern Africa. We thank them once again for their continued support and helping us to deliver this, which is a critical conversation for all of us. As we begin, I think I'll just go by how I see them on the screens and give them an opportunity to just give an introduction of who they are. Starting with Safira, then Tracy, then Vuyiswa, and then Dr. Nomhle.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you for this opportunity to speak with you. My name is Safira Patel. I currently head up the operations evaluation function at the DBSA, as well as the EGS, Environmental Social Governance function. The DBSA is a development finance institution, and we have been and will continue to be playing quite a critical role in the just transition and the environmental sustainable development sector. So we look forward to having these discussions and continuing our work with you.
Okay. Over to you, Tracy, in the Maldives.
I promise you I'm not in the Maldives. I wish I was. Hi, everyone. My name is Tracy Davies. I am the Executive Director of Just Share, which is a non-profit shareholder activism organization. We focus on responsible investment in South Africa and on using advocacy and activism and engagement to try to drive corporate South Africa to play a bigger role in tackling climate change and reducing inequality. It's great to be here this evening. Thanks very much.
Next, we have Vuyiswa from another exotic location. Sorry, Vuyiswa, I don't think we can hear you for some odd reason.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you.
Sorry. Good evening, everybody. My name is Vuyiswa Hlongwane. I work as a program associate for the Open Society Foundations based in Johannesburg, Rosebank. I work under social justice and economic development. Thank you so much.
And then last but definitely not least, Dr. Nomhle.
Cool. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Langa, for your kind words. I'm currently a research associate at WITS. I'm also a climate risk analyst for Nedbank. I'm passionate about everything that's got to do with climate change, sustainability, and most importantly, this huge topic that we'll be dwelling in today, which is the just transition.
Okay. So I don't know where to start today. I'm fortunate to be the rose amongst the thorns, or the thorn amongst the roses. I have no idea. But maybe let me start with you, Tracy. Tracy, what is the just transition and why is it significant for South Africa?
Well, the just transition is actually a concept that comes from the labor movement. It originated with the idea that we are living in a world that is using up our natural resources in an unsustainable manner, and that ultimately this will have an impact on everybody's jobs and on work across the globe. And the ILO, the International Labour Organization, was the original institution that kind of defined the just transition in the context of climate action. And the way that it does that is to say that the transition to a low carbon energy system has to be not just about energy, but most importantly about equity and about justice. And that we can't just have a system where we go from fossil fuels to renewable energy and keep everything else the same, but that very transition needs to be an opportunity for our societies to recognize historic injustices and inequalities and to redress those so that we can move towards economies which are more inclusive, which are sustainable, in other words, which are not using up more resources than we have available to us in the time we have available before climate change becomes, has even more serious and irreversible consequences than it does now. So it is a concept that encompasses our whole economic system and in fact our whole society, and says that when you are looking at climate action, you need to look at gender issues, at equality from a gender perspective, at racial injustice, at environmental sustainability, at inclusivity, at fairness, and that you need to take all of those factors into account when designing an economy that will shift from high use of fossil fuels to a low carbon system.
Maybe let me then come to you, Safira. I think South Africa, I think, is regarded as being one of the most unequal, if not the most unequal society in the world, with glaring gaps in between the haves and the have-nots, and a lot of other issues are always consistently brought up. So now, in managing the just transition, one of the indictments that has been made is how clean energy comes with the applications of technology and therefore is not as labor intensive. How do we manage the transition to make sure that it's just without us putting at risk jobs in a country that already has such a high level of unemployment?
Yes, absolutely. There is growing sentiment that if we transition our economy towards primarily renewable, which is actually what we want to do, we may lose a lot of jobs. We will lose a lot of jobs in the coal sector. We are a coal-dependent society. However, I think if you could flip it around and look at it from another angle and say, there are so many opportunities, funding opportunities, educational, innovation, jobs, new jobs, reskilling, upskilling, creation of new sectors. Technically, in making this transition and making this move, we'll be creating sectors and industries and innovating in such a way that we will be able to make up, reskill or transition people along the way. Remember, it's not going to be, as Tracy mentioned, it's not going to be a transition. It's not just a move, a big leap. It's going to be a just transition. And I'm confident that if we all give it a good shot, if we all apply our minds and we all make sure that we use the systems that we have, that are being revised, ESG principles, just transition principles, and we really focus, we won't have as much of a shock as people seem to think there will be coming away. There will be a shock, there will be changes. We cannot avoid that. However, the good news is that it's not just us. Lots of people are transitioning, lots of other countries are transitioning, and there will be the creation of new markets. I mean, you just think about one angle is we're actively involved in creating a pipeline of new projects to fund, not just to fund, but to create this just transition, to support the transition. And part of that would be to support the reskilling, upskilling, and the creation of new economies, new job economies, and new markets. It's not like we're just going to stop one thing overnight and then have job losses and everybody else is going to carry on with the renewable energy. The transition is possible if we direct our energies and our financing in the right direction. We won't have that negative impacts people seem to think we would.
Okay, maybe let me come over to Vuyiswa. I think one of the comments that was made last week was that from an investor perspective, one of their biggest fears around investing into South Africa is the pandemic that is corruption. Do you see the fact that government is the primary custodian for the just transition and the inherent threat of corruption that always looms large being something that could potentially threaten our just transition, and that we could find ourselves in a precarious place in terms of some of the stuff that needs to happen?
Thank you so much, Langa. I'm not sure if I'm audible. I definitely do agree with you in the fact that
your line is breaking now.
I'm so sorry. Hello?
Yeah, we can hear you, but it's quite faint.
I'm sorry, I'm working with very limited Wi-Fi access, so I think it might be affecting that. I was saying thank you so much for your question. I definitely do agree with the fact that South Africa does have a crisis when it comes to the governance and the corruption in our country. Without really getting into the politics of it, I do though, however, see the necessity for government with the transition process. Not only with government, I think the public sector, the private sector, the civic society sector, it has to be a collaborative, hello? Yeah, a collaborative initiative towards combating and actually successfully implementing this transition. So corruption could negatively impede on the rollout of it and on the success of it, but I do believe that with the right policies in place, it could be fine without the corruption.
Dr. Nomhle, maybe following on from the question that I posed to Uyiswa, another consistent indictment. I will come to the positive parts, but let's deal with the parts that are always a challenge. With South Africa is that we have wonderful policy frameworks, that the NDP is probably one of the most well-written policies, but we don't have the willpower and the consistency to deliver. What do you think are some of the areas where we have made commitments with regards to the just transition and have not necessarily to date been able to meet those milestones and those benchmarks?
Mm-hmm. I think to answer your question effectively, I'm going to look at, the rays of sunshine. And if you look at the NDP basically looks at our national social, a bit of environmental objective to 2030. And if you look at what's happened since 2013, which was when the NDP has come through, we've seen massive key environmental pieces and environmental policies come through. We've seen the carbon tax bill, we've seen the recent climate change bill coming through. And I think very importantly with that is we've seen the establishment of the PCC, which is the Presidential Climate Commission, which is really working hard on how do we rope in our various policies and how do we ensure that there is effective engagement to ensure that there is a just transition. And I think very importantly with the PCC, we really would see, I feel, going into the future, key stringent policies where not only is government held accountable, but corporates too, and NGOs, and just generally the public sector. I mean, if you look in the corporate sector, we're now seeing, strong measures around the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. TCFDs are becoming compulsory. And that is sort of a key component. And how do we hold corporate sector accountable and ensuring that they also contribute towards the just transition? So I think with this question, just transition is, a component where everyone is accountable and everyone has a responsibility. But also it's very important that we don't just only look at the NDP, we look at also what's been developed post the NDP up till now.
Maybe let me come to you, Safira. You work with a developmental finance institution. Are you seeing a lot of, shall I call it, collaboration between yourselves and the private sector? Are you seeing a significant uptake in terms of willingness to work together in the elements of the just transition? And then maybe after that, Tracy can tell us what are the challenges she's seeing as an advocate from corporate coming to the party on the just transition.
So the bottom line, yes, absolutely. There is a lot more partnership taking place with local organizations, local private sector, and also international private sector organizations, other MDBs, other banks. There's a great deal of work and project development taking place. There, obviously, within the South African context, we've got our REAP program, which is private sector and public sector coming together, which has proved to be very successful, maybe not fast enough, and maybe we can do a lot more there, but there is that partnership, there is that understanding and the need for working together. The one other thing that we're definitely seeing from a private sector perspective is, again, a need to show impact. And while this in some ways is great, because people need to show impact, they need to show success in development and sustainable impact, and it's really good to work with DFIs to facilitate this. But obviously, there's always a negative side of that as well. I mean, we've seen growth in, you know, and personal, I have personal views on also this massive growth in private sector of this development or the impact investment, which is great in principle, makes sense, if what you're actually trying to do actually takes place, if you've got the systems in place to prove it. So while we're having a great deal of projects coming through, there's a lot of project preparation, creation of a pipeline of projects to fund regionally in support of the just transition. There is also the one side that we need to make sure we're aware of, and that looking at the impact of these projects that are coming through. Because if you think about it, DFIs and private sector traditionally have different goals. I think the goals are converging now, but private sector was always primarily focused by profit. And in the sort of projects that DFIs do, we pick up where private sector won't invest. But now that we're coming together, we need to make sure we balance the two goals and we prevent greenwash, and we ensure that we actually do achieve the development impact that we're looking for. And so, yes, it is happening, but there are aspects and elements we need to be aware of, and focus on deepening that impact is critically important.
Tracy?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the challenges we see in the corporate sector are actually kind of similar to the broader political and economic challenges to a just transition. And I would say the biggest of those is the tendency to be very myopic in how we view the transition and what it means. So you will hear most people will immediately speak, of course, naturally, of the coal sector and of the implications of a just transition for the coal sector and for coal workers and for the value chain and the people who live in those communities where we generate electricity from coal. But we really need to be broadening the conversation in a very significant way, not just because of what we have to do, but also because of the impacts we're already seeing. You know, the agricultural sector employs about 10 times more people than the coal mining sector. And we are seeing huge impacts on the agricultural sector as a result of climate change. But we don't hear that discussed in policy decisions and in the corporate sector when we're talking about climate action. In the drought in the Western Cape, you know, a couple of years ago, more than 30,000 agricultural sector workers lost their jobs. In the recent floods in KwaZulu-Natal, the economic damage associated with those floods to infrastructure, to industry, to agriculture, to all of these crucial sectors of our economy is just immense. You know, you've got vast numbers of people in the construction sector, in the manufacturing sector, in the retail sector, who actually can't work at the moment because their companies are recovering from the floods. If you look at something like the Toyota manufacturing plant, you know, they've shut down for 3 months because of the damage caused by those floods. They'll do what they can, I'm sure, to support their workers while they recover. But that is a huge economic impact. And yet we're not talking about that in our national conversations about climate change. We're not talking about what's already happening. The other thing we're not talking about is the impacts of not taking some extremely dramatic and fast action to build renewable energy. Because we need to do this, we need to build approximately 5 gigawatts of renewable energy every year between now and 2030, just to plug the gap that's coming from Eskom between its retirement of old coal-fired power stations and its problems with maintenance, etc., of existing coal-fired power stations. We've only built 5 gigawatts of renewable energy in the last decade. Okay, we have to do that every year for the next 10 years. And yet we're stuck in these fights, in policy fights, in corporate fights, in arguments about whether we should be exploiting offshore oil and gas, or bringing in car power ships, or building gas-fired power stations, or we're stuck at this level of ideological kind of fossil fuel-based debates, when what we should be focusing on purely 100% is a massive build out in renewable energy, because that will generate the growth and the jobs and the industrial development that we need to survive this transition. I'll say one more thing before I be quiet. People talk about we need baseload energy, we need coal to provide reliable, affordable baseload energy. I don't know when the last time was that you looked at your electricity bill, but coal-fired power generation in South Africa is not affordable, and it is most certainly not reliable. PwC looked at South Africa's economy for 2021 and the impact of load shedding, and concluded that load shedding in 2021 cost our economy 400,000 jobs and reduced GDP by 3.1%. And that is because we are too focused on coal, too focused on Eskom, too focused on gas, too focused on fighting about fossil fuels, too focused on Gwedi Mantashe and Sasol and Exxaro and Tungela, and not nearly focused on what we should be looking at, which is a dramatic, rapid increase in the build out of renewable energy. And that's what every financial institution in this country should be looking at, focusing on in its entirety. Okay, I will be quiet now.
Yeah, but Tracy, let me still stay with you a little bit there. So one of the things that comes out as an indictment of the current situation that has happened is we get into the situation where Russia goes to invade Ukraine, and all of a sudden coal exports increase. And we're hearing this narrative that from an African perspective, we need to be moving to renewable energy. What's Europe using the coal for that they're buying from African mines? And doesn't that then allude to what the minister has been talking about, where he's saying we don't need just clean energy, but an energy mix that involves fossil fuel, nuclear, and so forth and so on? And how does that fit into the just transition?
Okay, so I mean, again, and I think Safira mentioned this, and anyone working in this space has to say this 5 or 6 times a day, it's a transition, okay? Nobody has ever suggested that we shut down coal-fired power stations tomorrow morning, that we get rid of all the coal workers. It's a transition, okay? The war in Russia has caused a severe global shock to energy, and everybody is scrambling to get hold of as much energy as they can in as short a space of time as they can. But the solution to that in the long term is not to dig our heels into fossil fuels, because fossil fuels are the problem in the first place. You can look at anything at the moment that's being written by Germany about Germany. They are saying we made a huge mistake being so dependent on fossil fuels from another country. What we should have been doing was improving our own energy security. And how should we have been doing that? With renewable energy. So, yes, of course, we need an energy mix at the moment. We have an energy mix at the moment. It's not contested, but these arguments are being used as a way to entrench vested interests, okay? And if you have the best interests of South Africa at heart, if you really have the best interests of South Africa at heart, what you will be pushing for beyond everything else is the most affordable, secure supply of energy. And that is renewable energy, and that is incontrovertible. So if you are pushing for development of new coal and new gas and new nuclear, you are pushing for forms of energy that are far, far more expensive, and you are condemning the people of this country to another couple of decades of unaffordable electricity, losing jobs, losing the manufacturing capacity. It is a no-brainer. Okay, that's my response to you on that.
Okay, maybe let me come to you, Nomhle. The opportunity set. We definitely need to be addressing the issue of unemployment, the social gap between the various areas and communities. Where do you see the opportunity set in the just transition? And I want you to talk to us probably of anything outside of energy.
Mm-hmm. So I think just with regards to, skills development and education, there's a recent publication which was released by the Department of Basic Education, just highlighting how COVID-19 had a massive, massive impact on the amount of pupils and learners in the basic education in terms of language and their acumen, right? So we are now dealing with not just only the COVID-19 pandemic, along also with corruption issues, but we are dealing with a young generation that is inheriting a problem that never created and needs skills in order to develop, and contribute towards the just transition. So I think the first thing that really, really is important in your question is we really need our government, corporates, society to get on board in terms of skills development, in order for us to really contribute to skills that are needed in the future. If you look at the hydrogen economy, the Department of Science and Innovation released a hydrogen roadmap in March. And part of that is looking at key skills as to how can we really contribute to a just transition, but ensure that we've got the necessary skills for the next 20 or 30 years. And so it's very important that we really, really do ensure that our communities are upskilled. I mean, if you look at what was happening in KZN, right, with the lack of skills, the lack of education, there were people who were living in informal settlements who were not educated and were not skilled enough to learn about the impacts of floods and the impacts that it will have on their livelihoods. So I think it's very, very important that not only is it just left to government, but to general society to ensure that we really do take it upon ourselves to educate individuals about skills. So for example, what is the government or what are society groups doing, in informal settlements to teach about early warning systems, or to teach about how do you effectively remove yourself from, a flood-ridden place into a safe area. So skills development is quite interesting because it requires massive engagement, but it requires all hands on deck as well.
Yeah, okay, maybe let me come to Safira before I go to Lisa. Safira, Nomhle raises a point here that skills development, but I'm going to use a crass analogy, and please allow me. Broad-based Black economic empowerment was a policy formulated by government that was supposed to ensure that 50 million odd people benefit from a transition in the ownership of the means of production. We now can only probably count 4 billionaires that have emerged from this. How are we sure that this just transition is not another economic opportunity for a small elite?
Okay, you give me the most difficult question, but yes. So it is difficult. We cannot prove what's going to happen, but again, it's a transition. We do have issues within the country from a social cohesion perspective and from the corruption, which is a key part of this discussion that you've just mentioned now. But what I like to see the Just Transition Act, and it's been discussed and alluded to here, is it's not about coal, it's not just about the socioeconomic. One very important element is the social cohesion that we need as a country to support the just transition. So if we transition without social cohesion, we're not going to get anywhere. And ensuring that we create jobs. I don't like to say jobs. Jobs are not always the best indicator of growth and a good economy. But if we create sustainable futures for everybody, which speak to more than just jobs and more than just energies, if we start speaking about biodiversity and the role of biodiversity in the transition, you bring it closer to people who can better understand what we're doing. And then you'll be able to create things that aren't your traditional job or your traditional economy or your traditional way of partaking in an economy. And that's how I believe we'll be able to facilitate the social cohesion to create the growth we need from a social perspective. And I really don't like to rely on jobs too much, but from a employment, economic activity perspective, if we broaden how we think about that, we will achieve more than BBBEE achieved. And I think there is a massive focus that needs to shift again away from purely energy. And if we start looking at, for example, the role of ecological infrastructure as opposed to just infrastructure, in providing a service. You're bringing a different discussion in, you're creating a different, almost economy, a different way of creating productivity that would facilitate that transition. So it won't just be an energy transition, just transition, or environmental transition. It's not about that. It's about facilitating social cohesion as we go along. And there are so many opportunities, again, beyond what everybody sees and hears. And if we think about jobs, economic opportunity, economic activity differently, we'll be able to facilitate. So it might not look like your traditional job. And sometimes I don't think your traditional job is actually what we always need. It's that economic activity, the ability to sustain yourselves, that we need to start working on and look at other angles and other areas to do it. For example, if you look at biodiversity, if you look at landscape economies, if you look at various other things, you can work towards that, but it's not easy. And it requires a shift and a change in how we approach things and a change in how we view a job or something that brings in sustenance for a community or a family. And that's a very big discussion, but I think it's critically important. And it's one of the key components of this. Again, it's not a job discussion. It's not a purely economic discussion. It's not an environmental discussion. It's not about energy, but it's about bringing them all together. And part of that mindset change is, what do we view an economy as? And what is economic growth? If we rethink that, if we share alternative ways of thinking about it, I think you'll be able to create those opportunities. People can see the opportunity, and then we can all go along the path. I hope that kind of answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. On behalf of ABSIP, thank you for that bold answer to a difficult question. Maybe let me go now to Buiswa. I think the president on Women's Day for 2 years has spoken about an apportionment of 40% of government spend towards women-owned businesses. Suffice to say, today there's no legislation that supports that. We even have a situation where the courts have said some of what is being managed by regulation is illegal. It should actually be looked at through the perspective of legislation. Another big concern that Labour continues to raise is that there's a huge fear that women and the youth will be left behind in the benefit from the just transition. Do you, in your perspective, feel that there's enough that is being done from a South African local policy perspective to ensure that the benefit will cascade to women and the youth?
Thank you, Langa, for the question. I don't know if I'm audible.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Struggling with my, okay, yeah. I definitely do not think that enough is being done towards supporting women and young people when it comes to this just transition process. I definitely think that more investment in SMMEs, which are youth-based and women-focused, is very important because generally there is this notion that SMMEs are never investment ready. So I think having more investment done towards those sectors would be very, very helpful for them. So yeah, using impact investing tools that are supportive of women and young people in South Africa, I think that would be very, very helpful within the process. So no, not enough has been done, in my opinion.
Let's say we appointed you as Minister of Just Transition, so again. Give us 2 or 3 things that you think you would apply as measures to ensure that we move in the right direction.
Okay, I think I'd focus on impact investing a lot, especially, and also investing in R&D, so research and development, ensuring that those
okay, so we seem to have temporarily lost Vuiso there. Maybe let me throw the same question at you, Dr. Nomhle. You are the Minister of Just Transition. What are some of the key initiatives that you'd immediately apply in order to assist women and the youth in terms of benefiting from the Just Transition?
I think very much aligned to what Vuyiswa had said. Research and development is very, very important. Skills capacity, skills development, education, being given to women and children who are the most vulnerable groups, not only in our country, but even on our continent as well. And it's important that they are empowered, through things such as SMMEs, and through things such as, employment opportunities that are given to them. But secondly, I think most importantly is also impact funding, but impact funding that not just only is able to keep businesses sustainable, but those very businesses that will have a social impact, but also environmental impact. I think most of the time, some of the discussions that we find around just transition, everyone is looking at, for example, the hydrogen economy, how much money is going to be made there, right? Or looking at, the big multi-coalition amount that we received last year during COP26. Everyone is very focused on this $8.5 billion, but nobody really is. We still have a long way to go in terms of how is this money going to be utilized to have a social impact, how many jobs will be created, but also what is the environmental impact of this? What other opportunities exist beyond, hydrogen? So for me, those are my top two. Is definitely research and development, and also impact funding.
Okay, maybe let me go to Tracy and Safira, and then give you the same question, and then you can give me your different perspectives on it. Some say, one of the commitments that has been made towards climate financing is this global commitment to 100 billion. There's a view, particularly again from Labour, that 100 million is actually meant to drive economic development still in the developed world, that it empowers us to establish the power stations that are wind powered, solar powered, etc. But it doesn't empower us to manage and maintain them, or to contribute in the value chain in terms of developing the technologies that go into it. What's your view around that point of departure in the conversation? Maybe Tracy, you can go first.
Sorry, Langas, are you talking about this, the $100 billion a year that the developed world is supposed to have been giving to the developing world, or not yes. The 8.5 billion COP26 money, right?
Oh, yes.
Okay. Yeah, I think that the whole thing is such a nebulous concept, and no one's ever come close to actually achieving those levels of financing. I think that it's a problem because it creates an expectation that the developed world needs to kind of somehow hold our hand through this process. I know we need finance. Finance is crucial, but the finance will come if we create the opportunities for the finance to come. And so I think that in some respects, and I mean, Safira as the financier will be better equipped to answer this, but I do think that sometimes those arguments are kind of counterproductive, because we can sit around and talk for as long as we want about what that money should or should not be used for. It isn't here yet. It hasn't arrived. It's still imaginary, right? And so we need to create an enabling environment where we can stand on our own 2 feet through this transition, and not be reliant on Western donors. And in there are many parts of Africa where that might not be an option, but South Africa is not one of those. We have an extraordinarily sophisticated financial sector that can make a huge contribution here. And I think we need to focus on that and not be distracted by arguments of which Western, who should we be depending on, and asking for money from overseas. But I'll let Safira give I'm sure, a more coherent answer to that question.
Thank you for that. I'm not sure if it's going to be more coherent, but I do agree that we need to focus on what the issues are and what we need to do. For me, one of the key issues is localization. So there's no such thing as a free lunch. All the money comes with conditions. in one way or the other. What we need to do within our local context as DFIs who are working in the space is make sure that when the money comes, it goes into the right place, into the right projects. And we can do that by developing, as Tracy said, the enabling environment. Project preparation and pipeline preparation is critically important. If we don't get that right, and I'm not just talking about, your REAP projects or putting up a production facility for solar panels or for wind turbines or whatever. It's again more than that. The discussion is way bigger than that. And it's making sure that we know what we want. And I think we do know what we want. We know where we need to go. And that's why the role for DFIs is critically important in getting that localization, directing the funding into the right areas, into where the need actually is, and not just into the big sexy projects. Everybody wants the big sexy projects. It's much easier to measure impact on big sexy projects. That I can assure you. But we need to look at the projects that have the biggest impact, but don't necessarily always need the biggest money. I mean, I've met quite a few projects which are much smaller, but have a much bigger impact than you'd expect a massive project to have sometimes. And so driving where the investment should go, what sort of projects we need to be looking at, creating that pipeline, those are critical discussions that we need to have. They are being had, but we need to have a lot more activity and involvement there. I mean, it shouldn't just be, the financiers having this discussion. The discussion needs to be opened up and we need to be able to know where to go. It's kind of like somebody telling you, oh, I'll build you a house, but I'm going to tell you how your house is going to look. And you're kind of like, well, then why build me a house? Because I know what I need in my house. I don't need X, Y, or Z. So we need to make sure we bring that down. We use our local knowledge and our local context to make sure that wherever the money goes, it makes sense. What we don't want, and I mean, it's a very real issue. I hate to always come back to energy again, but it's tended to happen. I've seen certain transition plans for other countries, organizations, parties where they say we're reducing our emissions and we're doing this and this is our just transition plan. But if you look at the nitty gritty, it doesn't mean they can't go and invest in fossil fuels elsewhere. So that's something else we need to be aware of. Just because the money's coming, does it actually mean it's going to go into the right place? And how are we going to direct it into the right place? Because, giving me a lot of money for a project that's going to result in stranded assets that nobody's going to use or is going to be a maintenance problem in the country later on is not actually development funding. It's not supporting anybody. It's not creating a job. So localization, making sure we direct the funding to where we need to go and creating that enabling environment, getting the projects growing, supporting the implementation, and making sure they're projects that are appropriate for what we need. That's critically important. But there is the funding, just what we do with it that's important.
Maybe you can follow on with that. I know you did speak about some of these and say that there are smaller opportunities that you're identifying out there and seeing in the ecosystem, if I can call it that. Are you able to give just a little bit of color in terms of what those opportunities are?
Sure. So, okay, if you take DBSA, for example, we're a DFI that focuses on infrastructure. And so when you say that, you think dams, power stations, energy plants, roads. If you think about it, before you put a wastewater treatment works in, and go back in the day before we had these wonderful things, nature serves as ecological infrastructure. Nature has that ability. What we've done is we've polluted and used and affected our ecosystem services and the ability to regenerate and to do what would naturally happen. And we've made ourselves more reliant on these hard, big infrastructure and services that we get from there. Whereas if we start moving towards, and I'm not saying replace everything with a reed bed and that's going to fix our problems. What I'm saying is if we start looking at biodiversity and nature and ecological infrastructure as an opportunity and plan our cities and our developments from innovative and green areas, you'll have different kinds of projects. You'll be able to get different people involved in these projects. And we'll be talking about biodiversity adaptation projects. I mean, one of the issues is that a lot of funding is going into mitigation and very little funding is going into adaptation. And there's a critical need for us to be able to have developed good and created good bankable projects within the biodiversity space, within the landscape financing space, as well as within ecosystem services. And that will have a direct impact on society, making sure we're able to adapt before we have these big shocks that come our way. So for me, it's biodiversity, ecosystem services. There's a whole set of things that can be done there that we're missing.
Maybe let me go to Dr. Nomhle in her capacity as a banker. I don't know if it's by day or if it's by night, but another part of what has not always been clear around the just transition is the financing instruments. And that in some instances, is it grants, is it debt, is it equity investments? And then also there's another sentiment that says sometimes it's called green, but is it green? What are some of the measures that are being put in place to ensure that, as Safira also alluded to, the capital or the investment is going to the right places, the impact that it is having is being adequately measured and reported, so that we know we're actually making progress in the direction that we are intending to go?
Thanks, Langa, for your question. I think the climate finance space is growing fast. And there are massive innovative instruments coming through. For example, in the bond market, we've got green bonds, we've got sustainability bonds. Very soon, we're going to even have social impact bonds. So the bond space is massive, and it's growing. But I think to allude to your second part of the question, looking at what is the impact, right? And I mentioned this earlier, that we've such as the task force on climate-related financial disclosures, which are, I think, will become mandatory for all banks to pursue in the future. And basically, that is where we then disclose, is really what you are saying, a green bond really legit? People want to see, where is this, the proceeds of the bond going to, and what is the impact? Also, very soon, what's popping up is we are also going to be headed into the task force on nature, financial disclosures. Nature is becoming a very, very important aspect. As Safira said, ecosystem services are also becoming protected. But also there's also massive mandate on a global level to protect our ecosystems and biodiversity. And I think corporates, and most especially banks, have a very important role to play in that. But the very interesting part is, if I issue a green bond, is it really green? And recently we just had, Deutsche Bank, which is one of the biggest, banks in the world, literally has been under fire. They has been asked to step down because they have literally exaggerated some of their ESG and some of the bond proceeds that they've mentioned in their reporting. So they would mention that we've actually allocated a certain amount of money towards ESG or towards environmental projects, but actually that's been exaggerated and that's a lie. So there's massive pressure and being taken to banks to ensure that is what you are saying really legit. And I think greenwashing is an issue that's quite interesting, right? It's something that needs to be regulated. I personally don't feel that it's firmly regulated within the financial space. And I think that groups have a massive role to play in holding banks, in holding corporates accountable, to ensure that what they do within the bank really does reflect the impact that they so like to prance around all the time, that we are having a social impact, we are having an environmental impact. So there's lots of greenwashing that is happening, but we also are responsible as citizens, as activist groups, as NGOs, as academics, to hold banks accountable, or even the corporate sector on that.
Maybe let me come back to Tracy, and then say, you deal quite a lot with funders. I think you deal quite a bit with asset managers who direct capital from retirement funds towards the investments. Are you seeing that shall we call it, the channels of capital and the owners of capital are taking the issue of climate financing seriously, as well as the impact of some of these companies on the environment seriously? And is enough being done?
Okay, well, the last question is an easy one to answer. No, not even close. You know, I think up until now, we've seen private finance and capital being directed towards green energy projects, if you want to call them that, where it's easy to do so. So the renewable energy independent power procurement processes were set up and designed in a very, very clever way that made it very easy and appealing for financial institutions to get involved. What we're not seeing is any really hard work and hard decision making going into directing capital away from those entities that are not supporting a transition or that are exacerbating climate change and not taking climate risk seriously. So I think at the moment, my personal view, as you say, dealing with this a lot, is that the financial sector still wants to have its cake and eat it. It still wants to be investing in green energy and making, as Dr. Ngwenya said, it's making a lot of noise in its sort of marketing materials about financing renewable energy and being committed to the just transition, but at the same time hasn't really changed business as usual when it comes to where capital flows are going and what's being supported and not supported. And it's crunch time. It's really crunch time. We essentially have 8 years to really make an impact, such as in such a way that we will be able to hopefully, and even then, it's not for sure, avoid the worst impacts of climate change. And yet we're still really sitting with a financial sector which is focused on very short-term incentives. And those short-term incentives are counterproductive to the kind of action we need to take to achieve a just transition. So yeah, I'm afraid it's not great news on that front from my perspective. And the Russia-Ukraine war and the energy price, the commodity price boom is really, really making that very clear. And I think that's a good thing, actually. It's showing up these commitments. It's showing up the extent to which the claims and commitments were really just that. They weren't actually action. And I think, Dr. Ngwenya referred as well, of course, to the DWS situation in Germany and, the kind of backlash, sort of a backlash against ESG is how it's being described in the media. But it's not a backlash against ESG. It's a backlash against greenwash. And it's a kind of global reckoning and a global understanding that actually until now, greenwash is the norm, not the exception. And so we've got to move to a point of accountability for these claims. You can't just say it and get clients and get kudos and awards for it when you're not actually doing what you say you're doing.
Okay. Maybe let me come to Safira before we go to Isabella is back. Safira, punitive measures. We've seen with a lot of stuff that happens in the investment space that as long as ESG is a nice to have and there's no fallout from not participating, the status quo remains. I think Tracy raises a good point that all the asset managers who had said they're only investing in green bonds and green solutions are suddenly holders of coal assets and are suddenly talking more and more about how the just transition should be managed. Is there anything punitive that exists within policy? And in fact, let's go a little bit further within legislation, within the countries that are participating in the just transition that can be used to ensure that we get to where we are going?
If we're talking about legislation and punitive measures, I think if we just go with most countries have the requirements for sustainable development. South Africa's got very good legislation with respect to environment and protection. We've got NEMA, we've got the Air Pollution Act, we've got all the acts. So that if you do pollute, if you do something that is harmful to nature or communities of people, you technically should be fined or should be taken to court. So there's that legislation, that framework out there generally. most countries, maybe some better than others, but I mean, there is the legislation. Obviously, some countries are really not very good on the environmental and protection side of things. But at a country level, most countries. But if you're talking about punitive measures, maybe if we look at it from a different angle of what do we have to push us and guide us in the right direction? And that's not necessarily from a legal perspective. I mean, within a DFI, it can be, because you can use the fact that we're not going to give you funding if you don't do X, Y, and Z, to direct funding and to make sure that, you know, when we do a due diligence on a project, we picked up ESG risks and environmental risks and climate social risks. We make sure that they're mitigated, and we make sure that the clients have condition precedents on deals so that they don't do X, Y, or Z. For me, the important thing is, do we actually go to that point and say, right, so you didn't do what we asked. Your EMP hasn't been fully implemented to our satisfaction, so we're not going to give you the funding anymore. I mean, when you're talking within DFIs, we still find there's still a big F in there, and it's still about finance. And people are incentivized to put money out there and to write deals, right? So until we change how we incentivize people to maybe write deals with the highest impact, that's probably what we need, less than just having punitive measures which may or may not be triggered. Also, then you speak about corruption and whether it's actually an issue. I mean, that's a whole different discussion. I mean, you have lots of countries which have really good legislation, environmental legislation like us, but there are still things happening that are not pushing us in the right direction. So I think there are punitive measures if you want them to be. It's about implementing them and following through on them. I mean, I have, from a development impact perspective, one of my bugbears is everybody just talks development impact. If you really understand impact, we're actually generally reporting on output, because output is the easiest thing to report on. When you start reporting on impact, that's a much bigger discussion, and you define impact in a much bigger way. So one of the problems is you will report on what you can easily measure, and that may not necessarily be the right thing to show whether or not we've achieved impact. And that's where a lot of the greenwashing comes in. So we need to think about putting in place the right measures to facilitate the right behaviors to help us along the just transition. And that speaks to how people are rewarded. It speaks to KPIs within organizations. I mean, this is such a wonderful topic. You can go all over the place with this. But yes, there are punitive measures. It's about whether they're implemented. Some people have them, some organizations have them, some don't. I would like there to be a lot more stick in certain areas, because that's the only way we're going to get there. But again, it's not always about the stick. We need to change behaviors more than anything else. And yeah, so yes, punitive measures, sticks, changing behaviors.
Okay. So maybe let me come to Visa now that she's back. I think one of the issues that we noted is the COVID pandemic happened, and according to government resources that were initially earmarked for education were shifted. Do we not run the risk of always having a crisis-driven approach to investing in the transition, and that if anything comes, this will be the first thing that we'll give up on and reallocate resources quickly?
Thank you so much, Langa, and apologies for that. I definitely do agree that we run a risk, as you said, because it's a crisis, which have led to funds being redirected. But I think Safira answered part of what I was going to say. I think it's important that we put in measures in place to ensure that that's not the case. So yeah, as Safira said, we need to put in punitive measures in place and a change in behavior. People need to believe that this transition is important and it impacts them as well.
Maybe let me ask you a follow-on question to say, part of what we need to be addressing, right, is definitely the social gap that exists within our ecosystem here in South Africa. And part of what the just transition offers is the opportunity for us to identify new areas. I think it's also been cited that one of the critical elements or challenges that South Africa has is on education and skills development. And I think Nomhle spoke to that a little bit. Do you think that we are currently doing enough to stimulate the development of new skills and skill set, matching them with what we think is the future that South Africa is looking towards?
No, we're definitely not doing enough to stimulate them. I think it's important that we need to have more investment in research and development. I think one thing that South Africa underestimates is the impact that research and development have when it comes to educating people on subjects such as this one. And so more investments in that and innovative solutions, I feel, would be more impactful for seeing a change with the just transition. I think it will make us more ready, and I think it will make people more aware and better learned on the subject as a whole.
Maybe let me come to you, Nomhle. Now we've got this the environment in which we exist currently in South Africa, and again, maybe let me stay a little bit longer on the issue of education. We've got a broken TVET framework, and many of the skills that we require are actually artisanal. Shouldn't part of what we are investing in, part of the transition, actually be in as Vuyiswa has alluded to, research and development, skills development, and shifting our economy, instead of us continuing to bolster traditional academic plans whilst trying to address a social issue?
I think importantly, Langa, all skills are needed in the just transition, right? As much as we may need artisanal workers and boiler makers, we also need scientists, we also need lawyers, we also need social scientists. So everyone and every skill is important in the just transition. But going back to your question on TVET colleges, I definitely think that there should be more that government does to invest, but not just only to invest in a TVET college to train students to become boiler makers or artisanal workers, but really how is their skill going to fit directly into the just transition? So for example, if I'm an artisanal worker and I get my qualification from a TVET college, what is my skill going to be? For example, if I get employed by a renewable energy company where I know that I'm going to contribute towards a scarce skill in the next 20 or 30 years. So I think the difference between TVET colleges and universities is sort of universities have a plan in terms of how do we use these skills to make sure that they are aligned with what higher education really sees, as scarce skills, as skills that we really need to develop the country, compared to TVET colleges, where if you are, good with your hands and you're good with electrical work, you can then become an electrician. But the next step is then how do we then empower TVET colleges to be like, okay, if you are great, with electrical work and to become an electrician, how do we then use your skills, to work at Saldanha Bay, to impact on the hydrogen economy? So I think short and all skills are very important, but more in terms of colleges and TVET colleges need more capacity in terms of how are those skills going to align towards the skills needed for just transition in the future, in the next 20 or 30 years.
Okay, now let me come to Zafira, based on something that Nomhle just said. How long till we actually see profits from investment in the hydrogen economy? Because we are chasing returns, right?
You're speaking to the wrong person on profits and hydrogen economy. I have absolutely no insight there that could add any value to this discussion, unfortunately.
Okay, let me rephrase the question then. We are saying let's invest in just transition where we want to go to clean, renewable sources across everything, right? Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I come from private equity and therefore I have a finite amount of time in which I need to hold this investment. Do I get to a point where I'm making money in 10 years? with my investment in this in these solutions?
Well, if you take the infrastructure development in support of the just transition, and this is a key role for why you need DFIs primarily involved in that to de-risk, because your typical large infrastructure projects are quite risky. They have very little to no returns, and they're not really the space that private equity wants to play in. So again, that's why we need to leverage what we have to de-risk the project to make it viable, so that private sector or private equity or whichever private capital can come in and actually get something out of it, because unless we do that, they're not going to come there, right? So it depends on the project. It depends on, what type of project we're dealing with, but I can't say you're going to get your returns in X period of time or Y period of time, because again, it also speaks to the fact that we also need to change the way we think about growth and development and equity, and what return is it that you actually want. I mean, there's recently been the Rhino bond that was issued. I mean, people who want to go invest in there in support of just transition and landscape finance are using something else. They don't necessarily want the returns now. They're wanting to make sure that you can see a change in rhino populations and conservation, which will then help with landscape conservation. So it depends on what return you want. And if we're just going to keep focusing on financial, I know it's difficult to just move away from financial returns because we all love those. But we need to rethink what we value as part of this just transition and the big change we're going to make, because you're not necessarily just going to keep on focusing on returns. There's going to be other returns we need. We need social returns. We need social cohesion. If we don't have social cohesion, it doesn't matter how many financial returns and profits you're making, it's actually not worth anything.
Okay. Maybe let me then come to Tracy before I then give but if anyone who's in the audience has a question, please pop it into the Q&A. And then we'll see how many of those we can get through. Tracy, along the same lines, right? As you're having conversation with the businesses, what's the incentive if the financial returns are dampened for promoting the investment into more sustainable avenues beyond it being something that's the right thing to do?
Well, this is always an interesting question, because it always creates the impression that those making the investments live on a different planet to those of us trying to ensure that the investments are sustainable, right? Asset managers, pension fund trustees, banks, these are all human beings who live on the same planet, who have children, who will have grandchildren, who will need to retire into a world that is actually livable. And so, it does really go back to this question that Safira keeps coming to, which is, for as long as we focus on growth and returns as the primary outcome of economic activity, we aren't going to create a more sustainable planet. And this is where you get to the point where people start saying, oh, you're just a bunny hugger, you're just an just an activist, you don't understand the economy, you don't understand this, and people need to make money and people need incentives. Okay, fine. But if you're going to have to spend 3/4 of your pension retrofitting your house to survive multiple floods and hurricanes and storms and droughts, and then what was the point of making all those returns in the first place? So it really is quite an existential question. And I mean, I ask myself this all the time in engagement with businesses, especially when it comes to things like financing massive, very clearly destructive fossil fuel projects. The executives of these companies are also human beings. How can they not see the impact that these investments are going to have on the future of their own descendants, So it's a strange thing. I don't really know how to understand it, but we have to change the way we think about returns. We have to change the way we think about it, because otherwise we won't have any returns to think about.
Yeah, So it's actually funny. I think in the conversations around pension savings, I think one of the union guys said, "What's the use of saving for tomorrow I won't see?" Do you not think that in some, yeah, anyway, maybe that should go down a different rabbit hole there. We saw you are in Zambia, and I know you do quite a bit of traveling into the continent. Are you seeing or hearing the conversation of just transition beyond our borders? And what are you hearing, if anything at all?
So no, the topic of just transition is not as important in Africa from my experience, as in the things that I'm hearing on the ground. I'm seeing more of a focus on investing in SMMEs, particularly in the impact space. There's a huge focus right now on matching the demand side with the supply side of investment capital. There's also more of a focus on standardizing impact measure. So just transition in most it's most topical in South Africa, I think. Should it be this way? Yes and no. South Africa is very coal reliant. So, and one of the largest carbon emitters in Africa. So it makes sense that it's more important for us, but this impacts all of us and the rest of Africa. So the conversation should be broadened, and we do need to co-create as a continent to transition and make sure it's a conversation that we're all having.
Okay. Let me come to Nomhle. I think we raise quite a critical point in the fact that is South Africa doing enough to lead in the conversation across the continent on just transition, especially understanding how Africa is called the dark continent because when you fly over, the majority of it is dark. And if you go to places like Nigeria, there's an energy deficiency. Are we doing enough to be a leader in the space across the rest of the continent?
Sure, I think this is so I think your answer is twofold. So I think we can do more, right? I think South Africa has a rich history in terms of just even being on an international platform. If you look at different conference of the parties, our international engagements, you've got very, very strong, South African presence there. But if you really look at countries like Kenya, Rwanda, Uganda, and you really, really look in terms of, for me, they just transition really, really places people at the forefront. There's massive investment in women empowerment, especially in the SMMEs, massive work being done around education. Some of the cities in Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda are considered world-class in terms of their cleanliness, right? We only have a few cities in SA that we can actually really, really call clean. So they're doing lots of work there. There's lots of, I could say, social impact that's happening in terms of their just transition. So in terms of us, I think that there could be more work in terms of fostering engagement, ensuring that we've got, strong compliance, strong regulation, really holding our government accountable. So yes, we are doing great work, but there could be so much more that we can do, especially if you benchmark us against Namibia, Botswana, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda. I that there could be more. I mean, if you even look at Egypt, Egypt is really, really, active within the green economy, active within, searching for other clean, clean energies. And, the question that everyone always says is, we can't really benchmark ourselves against other African countries because we have a history of coal mining, of using dirty fuels. But if you really look at what other countries are really doing to transition away and really be world players in the clean energy space, I definitely think that set aside corruption, set aside the politics, as Tracy wonderfully said, and really hold our leaders accountable, I think that we could be world-class, competing with the likes of Denmark, of Norway, of the other Scandinavian countries.
Okay. I saw, Tracy, do you have a view on that? Would you like to add?
No, I mean, I agree that we could be doing so much more. You know that Denmark derives 75% of its power from renewable energy. Denmark is a cold, tiny country at the top of Europe, and they get 75% of their power from renewable energy. We are, I know this is not exactly to your point, but it does we have the best renewable energy resources on the planet, and we can't get more than 5% of our power from renewable energy because of the ridiculous nature of our political and economic system here. And so South Africa, I think, you know, at a government level in particular, is so snarled up in these vested, as I was saying earlier, vested interest conversations and ideological debates about gas versus nuclear, that, you know, we just, there's just so much opportunity. I think that's the scariest thing. There is so much opportunity for us to grasp this transition and to transform the nature of our society with it. And so, you know, we can't even get it right here. And so I think that in itself inevitably means that we're not setting an example for the rest of the continent. I do also just have to pick up on your comment, Langa, about flying over Africa and it being dark and Nigeria having an energy deficit. Nigeria, of course, being one of the world's biggest oil producing countries, right? And they have a massive energy deficit and huge lack of energy access across their population. And yet you see every single day someone saying that Africa needs fossil fuels for energy security and to reduce energy poverty. There is, you know, there's a huge and a very dangerous, I think, trend happening where people are realizing that they can use that African history and context as a way to justify the use of more fossil fuels, when in actual fact, the way to address Africa's challenges is exactly the opposite, is to leapfrog the corruption and the environmental devastation and the poverty that comes from trying to extract those fossil fuels and move to much more equitable, affordable, distributed energy access for the continent.
Okay. We have questions here. The first one is directed to Safira. It says, I have a question for Safira. How can the rest of the DFIs in Africa and the international ones as well, both unilaterally and multilaterally, support South Africa through the transition?
How? Well, I think the how speaks to, well, partnership, co-finance, and knowledge sharing, and making sure we create the projects that we can therefore fund. I mean, again, it's not always just about funding projects. There's this massive capacity building elements. There's supporting and getting systems and policies and processes in place. There are lots of different elements to it. It's not just about putting big projects in place which require funding. And there is a lot of work being done across the partners. There's the International Development Finance Club, where there's a lot of discussion, participation, co-funding, partnerships on a great deal of things to facilitate sustainable development and the just transition. You know, so DBSA might be doing something with IDFC, which will ultimately become a handbook, which other DFIs can use as part of their just transition journey. So it's funding of projects, co-finance, leveraging, knowledge sharing, capacity building. You know, one thing I've found is in all the discussions we have about the just transition, we're all somewhere at the beginning. Nobody has it. It's kind of not that it's new. We all know sustainable development, just transition, but actually jumping into it and making it happen, everybody's pretty much grappling with the same things. So the good thing is that we all work together and we solution with each other and we go forward. So yeah, for me, that's how the other DFIs and banks and partners would work together. It's kind of just, let's walk the journey together, and let's hopefully get there soon.
There's another question here. I'm just going to pose the question to the floor. Whoever wants to respond can go ahead. It's around hydroelectricity. So let me start first by saying, is hydroelectricity a green and renewable solution? And secondly, what are we doing to take advantage of the opportunity of hydro on the African continent?
I'm happy to go for that one. We had
you can go first.
So yes, hydro, firstly, let's start with this. South Africa is a water poor country. Let's just put that as a start to that discussion. Yes, we can have hydro, large and small scale across Africa. Zambia, for example, gets a lot of its energy from Kariba and Itesheteshi, and Zimbabwe as well, and we have Cahora Bassa. But in developing new hydro projects for renewable energy, I think there are a few things we need to bear in mind. Number one, with climate change, certain areas are going to get hotter and drier, and certain areas are going to get wetter with more extreme events. So the way you design your dam is critically important. But then with sustainable development and just transition especially, the issue of net positive is critically important. So building a dam to provide energy that causes biodiversity loss, facilitates the resettlement of, 5, 10, 20 different communities and villages. People have to find new ways of living, new jobs, farmers now have to become fishermen if you're going to dam the entire area. There's so many nuances and critical issues that also need to cover it. So unless you can put out a dam that's going to give us a lot of renewable energy in an area where you're not going to impact the ecosystem, you're going to maintain that ecological base flow, you're going to have a net positive outcome, then yes, but it's also a massive impact and massive funding would go into that. But it's not that easy to have large hydro projects providing a lot of renewable energy that is net positive. If you think back in the day, there was a moratorium put on dams for a reason by the World Bank. I mean, it's been lifted now, but that's something to consider. So even though you think water would give us, hydro would give us renewable energy, great. It's the net positive that we need to focus on. Because if we don't, we're again messing with a just transition. You're taking one or two elements out.
Okay. So we're down to our last 3 minutes. I always want people to finish your time so that they can go and do whatever it is people do in the evening. Dr. Nonhle, 1 minute, your key input to the global conversation on just transition.
A just transition is one that is also transparent. I think in most of our energy talks, it's very important that we actually have a very fair, open, transparent overview as to what does a just transition mean. But I think this transition is also personal, and it requires us also personally to go within and actually ask yourself, what does a just transition mean for yourself? For a person who is living in poverty, that is very difficult because for them, their first, mode of action is, getting their next meal. But for you who is empowered, who is educated, I think it's very important to ask yourself, what does a just transition mean? And how do you hold those in power accountable for ensuring this transition and ensuring that it is effective?
Okay. Vuyiswa, 1 minute. What does a just transition mean for you, your global contribution? Okay.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you now.
I think a just transition for me is, all I can say to it is just it's collaborative work, ensuring that different sectors come together to create a society and an environment that is cleaner, that is healthier, that is going to positively impact the lives of the communities that were negatively affected by these different, what can I call them? Like the CO2 emissions and I think for me, just transition is basically from different sectors to ensure that the environment benefits positively as well as its people and the community.
Okay. Tracy, 1 minute. Your stakeholders are listening in terms of the asset managers. What do they need to do different to use their influence positively to drive the just transition?
Look at this holistically, not just from the angle or the lens of the coal industry. Focus on our country as a whole, on all the different sectors and people that have a role to play in making our economy more inclusive and more sustainable. And think a little bit more than 3 months ahead, 6 months ahead. Try to think maybe 5 years, 10 years, a little bit more longer term horizons, I think would go a long way towards helping us make some better decisions on these issues.
Thank you. And now, Safira, you're a financier speaking to legislators, regulators. What's the one policy you want to see that helps us accelerate our transition?
Oh, okay. It's not a policy. It's an ask. The ask is that I agree with everything the other panelists have said just now. In addition to that, it's about each and every one of us individually positioning ourselves in the discussion and doing what we can. And most importantly, thinking about what we value and revaluing what we think of as growth and what we see as a future. Because once we can revalue that, we'll be able to find our way through it.
Okay. On that note, I'd like to first start by thanking my panelists, Safira, Dr. Nomke, Tracy, Vuiswa. Thank you for taking time out to join us this evening, especially Vuiswa who's in Zambia and Tracy who's in the Maldives. I'm sorry, Tracy, I just can't let it go. And Tracy who's with us in Joburg. Thank you so much for making time this evening. I would also like to take this opportunity to thank Development Bank of South Africa for partnering with us as ABSIP. Thank all those who have taken time as well to attend and listen, both on the Zoom platform and on YouTube. And thank you to our technical team and Tapiwa Tule, who have assisted in putting the whole thing together. On that note, we've come to the close of the session this evening. Thank you for watching my YouTube channel. As always, click subscribe and like, and see you next time as we continue to have these intriguing conversations. Good night and enjoy your evening.
Thank you.
Thanks.